Hello, my name's Antony Scott from MapAction, and I'm going to talk to you today about a blog that MapAction and CartONG put together a couple of months ago about some tips for mapping in a pandemic. So here we go with the presentation. So a lot of people have been looking at ways of mapping the current pandemic, and some of you will be new to mapping, some of you will have been doing it for a long time. So CartONG and MapAction a few months ago thought it might be a good idea just to put together a few ideas, a few pointers on things that might and might not work in terms of communicating what's going on. So here are our tips. There's lots of other things you can do, but these are just our ideas. The blog itself, on which this talk is based, can be found on the CartONG website. So if you Google CartONG blog, you should be able to find it, and you'll find a bit more detail there and some links to other useful resources. So first off, don't reinvent the wheel. This may sound obvious, but it's surprising how many people have tried to create their own dashboards or maps of things which have already been done very satisfactorily elsewhere. This example is the Johns Hopkins University website, which is a pretty well used resource, has been throughout the pandemic. So don't try and recreate this. If you think you have a need which means that you need to do something a bit more specific, or something which adds something, or which is has been requested by your community, then by all means go ahead. But generally it's a good principle to have a look around before you start work on a map, to make sure that it's not already in place and allowing you to spend your time doing something more useful. There's another fundamental rule, which is to try and keep your map simple and to the point. Your map needs to have some kind of message, and the map on the left you can see is pretty crowded. There's a lot there. It's really not clear either what the map is trying to portray, or what the individual layers are representing. There's an example on the right, which is, I think, an example of good practice, whereby we're looking at partner presence after the Beirut port explosions last month. It's pretty clear what it's trying to convey. The map is very simple. There's only a couple of layers really in the legend, and I think if you're interested in this area, you can pretty quickly get a picture of what it is you're trying to find. So keeping it simple is a phrase we hear a lot, and I think it's a question we need to repeat and to ask ourselves when we're producing maps, and after we produce the map, have we got a level of simplicity which is appropriate, i.e. as simple as possible and no simpler. So that's just a couple of examples there. One thing which is important in the current climate is to use data which is solid and which is verifiable, and which comes from reliable sources, and that it's being presented in a way that is actually meaningful to the end user. So in these examples, we're looking at data here which comes from the UK government, and there's a daily dashboard here. This is produced in the Guardian, which is a UK newspaper, on their website every day, and it's updated with the latest figures. And although it's pretty simple, it just does what it sets out to do. but as well as it actually crams quite a lot of information into a small space, and as well as showing an overall trend since the outbreak of the pandemic. It also shows movement up or down since last week, and the current figures. And crucially, there's metadata underneath, or explanation underneath, which gives a bit more background on where the data is coming from. And you'll notice that it even points out that there are some anomalies in the data arising from technical issues, which those in the UK will probably be aware of, but which concern a slightly erratic use of Excel. So I think the key thing here is the word meaningful. This data is pretty easy to understand. There's no maps involved here, but maps are not always the right way of presenting information. In this case, maps are to be found elsewhere on the website, but this is just a headline. This is all about headline figures. And equally, if you're showing evolution over time, try and highlight the differences. That's what people are going to be interested in, is if time is a factor. So you need to make it easy for the user to see how things change from point of time A to point of time B. And in this example, this is a map that has been created for this purpose, but you can see it's not really telling a story very effectively. We've got a couple of snapshots there, but it's not really possible to see what the difference is between the two. So try and guide the user, the end user of the map, in the direction of the indication of what has actually changed since the last date that the map was published. And that can be done through use of colors, it can be done through use of symbols, or it can be done, if the visuals are strong, in a sort of side-by-side analysis as well. So let's talk about metadata. And metadata, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the idea of data about data, or data which gives a bit of context to the information that you're providing. And the kind of situation in which metadata is useful is if a map is, you pick up a map, maybe it's been printed out, maybe it's been dropped into a report, and you need to know who produced that map. You need to know when it was produced, where did the data come from, and how you can contact the producer, what the organization was. There's a couple of examples here. So on the right hand side, this is a standard metadata block that MapAction produces, and it shows things which are particularly relevant to mapping, including things like the projection and the scale, but it also shows some standard data, including attribution of individual data providers, a credit for our donors, for MapAction donors, and things like dates and contact details. And you can see as well down the bottom of this map, down the bottom of this slide, some metadata which I've also dropped in, and it's not actually really possible to read at this scale. That's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to be headline stuff. In fact, it's quite useful for it to be tucked away, because it's there if people need it. So if you need to know that information, if you peer at the screen closely enough, you'll probably be able to work it out. In the case of a printed map, you'll be able to look at it and get that information, but it's not intended to be the main message of the map. But it does give a very important set of traceability information, which gives the map its context and means that it's not just a meaningless picture, which nobody knows when it was done and who did it. So metadata should not be forgotten. There's other contextual information which needs to be added to maps, because it's often useful in looking at information to see comparisons. So on the right hand side is a map of the coronavirus outbreak from September. This comes from the FT website, Financial Times in the UK. And you can see that there's a comparison between countries, and this is a pretty common way of doing a comparison. Because people need to know, it's very helpful for people to know where to place things on a scale. So how are we doing with other countries? How are we doing with this time last week? And you can do that in a number of ways. This is just one example. It's a fairly standard mapping visualization technique where the symbols represent different numbers, but colors can be used. Comparison side by side maps can be used. The important thing here is to realize that information on its own is not necessarily useful without readers having the ability to compare it with other information. Now, data can be dangerous. Data can be used to identify individuals. We're all aware, I'm sure, of the implications of sharing of personal data, both with and without consent. And in the humanitarian context, this is as important, if not more important, than anywhere else. So even if you have data available at, say, a household level, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a good idea to show it, because it's not necessarily a good thing for this to be available, particularly if you're publishing something publicly to the outside world. And clearly there are all kinds of ethical and privacy and legal implications for all of this, and some of those are being addressed elsewhere in this conference. But I think a good question to ask yourself is, often in these circumstances, is would you be happy for your own data to be shared in this way? And if the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't be publishing somebody else's data. So this is just a general caveat for using information, and bearing in mind that maps can be used to identify things like houses, and houses can be used to identify individual people. I think a common issue which many people have when making maps, and I include myself in that, is that it's hard to know when good enough is actually good enough, as it were. When do you stop? When do you stop fine-tuning, adding information, maybe seeing if something can be improved, because you're aware that you're producing something which may have a long lifespan, which may be circulated to a lot of people, and you want it to be as good as it possibly can be. So there's no right or wrong answer to this, but sometimes it's important to recognize that the key factor is speed. And certainly that's something that we're aware of in MapAction, which is why a lot of our maps are not necessarily terribly pretty. But we place a high level of importance on getting information out quickly. So it's sometimes useful to think in terms of producing an initial version, which then can be refined and improved over time. And sometimes it's just worth getting something out. I hesitate to use the term quick and dirty because they're not necessarily dirty maps, but certainly quick, and quick and clean maybe is a better description. So bear in mind that the people you're delivering to may not be interested in a fantastic level of quality. They may just be interested in getting the information on a map in front of them so that they can start to assess the situation, start to make some decisions. And that applies in pandemic mapping as well as much as it does in anything else. Be aware when you're making maps that you may need to be updating them over time, and if possible, try and make them, build them in such a way that they can easily be updated. This map is one that was developed for the Ebola outbreak in 2014. And although it's a perfectly adequate map, it does have an issue which a number of these kind of maps have, which is that the scale isn't necessarily the color scale that's been used, the color ramp to show the number of Ebola cases in different areas, doesn't necessarily have the ability to scale up as if the outbreak continues to grow, because what will happen is that there will simply be more and more cases in the darker colors, in the areas with the darker colors. The distinction between different areas will be lost. So that may be something which is difficult to avoid, but you need to take that into account. Certainly, if you're planning to produce a regular map or a regular update to a map in a changing situation, so that it can be treated accordingly. So, for example, you may want to simply change the color scheme each time the map is produced, so as not to mislead readers of the map into thinking that changes have happened when they actually happened. And finally, maps need to be seen by people to be useful. So don't assume that once you produce the map, your work is done, unless you have a good dissemination and distribution strategy and the mechanism to carry it out. Your map really won't be very useful to anybody. Now, clearly there are lots of ways of passing maps around through web portals and organizations such as humanitarianresponse.info, MapAction. We have our own website, we have our Twitter feed, which automatically generates a tweet for every map that we produce. And indeed, we're often distributing maps on paper, and paper is still one of the main means of distribution for emergency humanitarian work. So don't discount that as a means of distribution, but do take into account that in order to be useful, you must have a means of getting your map in front of the people that are going to use it. That's all I've got to say. Have a look at the blog. There are plenty more tips, and I think more importantly, there's some links there to various resources which you may find useful. I think my final word would be, don't be put off from making a map, even if you've never made one before. It's not too difficult these days. There's tools which can help you to do it, and you're going to be setting out on a journey which is all about providing information in a useful way. So good luck with that.